Revision, Part 3. The Late Middle Ages. Let's now look at the revival of Roman law during the Late Middle Ages. Here, we are looking at the study of the Corpus Juris Civilis. Roman law was revised through the scientific study of Justinian's Corpus Juris Civilis, and many different groups studied this codification of Roman law. The first group was the Glossators. The Glossators used the interpretive method to study the Corpus Juris Civilis. This can also be referred to as the exegetical method. This means that they analyzed the text, they tried to understand the difficult sections, and they tried to find the meaning of unclear words. The Glossators first concentrated on understanding the text, and they wrote explanatory notes in the margins of the text and between the lines. These notes were called glosses. The Glossators' analysis was important because it showed contradictions in the text. The Glossators then extended their activities to include the making of short summaries, the making of hypothetical problems with answers, and they gave lectures on specific topics covered by the Corpus Juris. The most important Glossators. We can remember these by using the following acronym, IVA. Imerius. Imerius was known as the father of the Glossators. Vicarius. Vicarius was a missionary who founded a law school at Oxford in England. Accursius. He wrote the Glossa Ordinaria. This was a collection of important previous glosses. So why were the Glossators so important? They helped to restore pure Roman law. They started the scientific study of Roman law. This is referred to as the Golden Age of jurisprudence. And they were responsible for the spread of Roman law. So if they did all of this good, why were the Glossators criticized? The Glossators believed that Justinian's word was law, and therefore they disregarded any inconsistencies in the text. They did not follow a structured order when they were working, and therefore we can say they had a lack of systemization. They also lacked historical perspective, and they did not take into account the developments since the fall of Rome. They had an impractical point of view. This was because they ignored changes in the laws which had been introduced to fix the new problems in time. Finally, Accursius left out some very important glosses in his collection called the Glossa Ordinaria. Let's look at the Glossators and canon law. During this time, there was also a renewed interest in canon law. Gratius, a monk and a trained jurist, published a collection of canon law sources called the Decretium Gratiani. Later, other codifications were added to the Decretium Gratiani. This new collection of canon law was called the Corpus Juris Canonici. It was studied by a group of jurists called canonists. The Ultramontani. The Ultramontani were jurists who studied at the French law school of Orleans. They were sometimes called those from the north of the Alps. This is because Orleans in France was geographically located to the north of the Alps. The Ultramontani used a dialectical approach when studying the Corpus Juris. This means that they used critical analysis and had a hands-on approach. Take note that the word dialectical means the use of logical arguments or reasoning. The Ultramontani wanted to incorporate Roman law into their current day practices. To do this, they investigated other sources of law which were necessary for practice. The sources of law used by the Ultramontani were the following: the Corpus Juris Civilis, town law, canon law, and Germanic customary law. So who were the most important Ultramontani? Well, an easy way to remember this is by using the acronym RUB. The U in the middle stands for the Ultramontani, while the R and the B give us a clue as to their names. R stands for Ruvenzhi, while B stands for Belapesh. The Ultramontani and Canon Law. The Ultramontani were the first group of jurists to create the rules for the reception of canon law into secular law. Canon law is church law. It deals with religious matters, and it is said to be fair. From the 12th century onwards, canon law strongly influenced the French law of procedure. It was also later received into Dutch law. Let's now look at secular law. Secular law is non-religious law. In other words, it is Roman law that deals with non-religious matters. This law was seen to be strict and severe. Let's now look at the third group who studied the Corpus Juris Civilis. In other words, let's look at the post-glossators. The post-glossators can also be called commentators. They used the scholastic method of study. This means that they interpreted and gave their opinion on both the Corpus Juris and the glosses, and they harmonized the conflicts found between the different sources of law. The post-glossators, or the commentators, focused on the practical aspects of the law. They used the following sources of law: the Corpus Juris Civilis, the Glossa Ordinaria, town law, canon law, and Germanic customary law. Their work included the following: commentaries. These commentaries were made because they wanted to provide rules which would serve the problems of time. Legal opinions. And they also gave lectures. So who were the most important commentators? Well, a clue to remember them is that the word commentators starts with a C. And what comes before C in the alphabet? B. So our important commentators' names will start with C and B. Our first commentator was Sinus. Sinus was a great Italian jurist. He was the first to be influenced by the works of the Ultramontani. Bartolus was his student. Bartolus is regarded as the greatest medieval jurist. He was best known for his commentary on the Corpus Juris Civilis, and his influence is still felt today in private international law. Finally, we have Baldus. Baldus was Bartolus' student. He wrote commentaries on the Corpus Juris Civilis and on canon law. So why were the commentators important? They laid the foundation for the 17th century school of natural law. Bartolus laid the foundation for modern private international law. This is also referred to as the conflict of laws. Finally, the commentators incorporated Roman law into their daily practice of law, and this played an important part in developing a European jus commune. We will find out more about this a little bit later. The criticism of the post-glossators. The post-glossators, or the commentators, used poor Latin. They focused on the majority opinion and did not give any regard to the minority. And they often ignored the original text, which resulted in a loss of historical perspective. The commentators and canon law. The commentators saw Roman law and canon law as being separate. In certain matters, canon law had to be applied instead of Roman law. These matters were spiritual matters, church matters, and any cases where the application of Roman law would amount to a sin. Let's now look at what a European jus commune is. This was the law used by many Western European countries. During the 12th and 15th centuries, there was a spirit of universalism in Western Europe. Jurists across Western Europe communicated with each other using Latin as a common language. The European jus commune originated when Roman law and canon law were received into the Germanic customary system. This means that it is made up of Roman law, canon law, and Germanic customary law. Roman Dutch law, Roman French law, and Roman German law have all developed from this gradual reception of Roman law and canon law, and thus we can say that the legal systems across Western Europe are all very similar. An African jus commune. Today, there is a drive to unify and harmonize the laws of many different African countries. If and when this happens, we will be able to call this an African jus commune. Note that this has not yet happened. The South African Law Association is a term which refers to countries in southern Africa whose legal systems are based on Roman Dutch law, as influenced by English law and African indigenous law. This applies in countries such as Lesotho, Botswana, Zimbabwe, Swaziland, Namibia, and South Africa. Let's now look at the legal developments that happened across Europe during the 16th, 17th, and 18th centuries. We will start with the reception of Roman law in France. It is important that we look at the reception of Roman law in France before the 16th century and after the 16th century. Let's start with before the 16th century. Here, the reception of Roman law in northern France was limited, but the reception in southern France was a wide reception. Let's now look at this in more detail. We will start with northern France. To recap, we are dealing with before the 16th century and we are dealing with northern France. We have just said that northern France had a limited reception. So why was there a limited reception in northern France? The reception of Roman law was resisted in the north because the king and the pope felt that their power was threatened by Roman law. The northern people were also still attached to their customary laws. However, despite this, Roman law was still received in the north through the Leges Romanae Barbarorum and the Ultramontanes Law School in Orleans. Let's now look at southern France. We are dealing with southern France before the 16th century. During this time, there was a wide reception of Roman law. This is because of the promulgation of the Lex Romana Visigothorum during the Frankish period, and because the Glossators established a law school at Montpellier. The Ultramontani also established law schools at Montpellier and Toulouse. If you recall, we learnt earlier that the Ultramontani first established themselves in Orleans, in northern France. So why are we dealing with them in southern France? It is important to note that although they started in Orleans, they later opened schools in the south of France at Montpellier and Toulouse. Let's now look at the reception of Roman law in France after the 16th century. During this period, we are dealing with a group of scholars called the French humanists. Unlike the glossators, Ultramontani, and the commentators, the French humanists studied both the Corpus Juris Civilis and the original sources of Roman law that came before Justinian's codification. The humanists used classical Latin, which is why they were also called the elegant school. The humanists wanted to study law as a system in its entirety. In other words, they wanted to study the whole system. So who were the most important humanists? To help you remember, we can think of the following. Humans like to listen to CDs. The letter C stands for Cujacius. Cujacius was a university professor who reconstructed old classical texts. The letter D stands for Donelus. Donelus was a university professor who made a great contribution to the spread of Roman law in the Netherlands. So why were the French humanists important? They systemized the Roman legal material. Their work was of a high standard and it focused on pure Roman law. They also helped to spread Roman law. Let's look at the criticism of the humanists. The humanists only studied Roman law in its pure classical form. This means that they ignored the developments over time. Therefore, they were very impractical and had no influence on the current day's practice. Let's now look at the codification of French law. Note that the word codification means to record or write down. Napoleon was a French emperor. He codified French civil law in the Code Civil. And he also abolished feudalism. We have already learned before that feudalism is where non-landowners live and work on the feudal lord's land in return for the payment of tax and loyalty. Let's now look at the reception of Roman law in Germany. There was an extensive reception of Roman law in Germany. We can call this in complexu reception. Let's now look at the reasons for this reception. Germany had different customary laws in every region. They needed a single, well-developed legal system, and the answer was Roman law. Roman law also spread through the influences of the Church, and Roman law was taught in German universities. During the 17th and 18th centuries, a new school of law was followed. This was called the Iustus Modernus Pandectarum. These jurists followed both a theoretical and practical method of studying law. They concentrated on studying Roman law, which applied in practice during their time. So who was important in this school of law? Carbozovius II was one of the leading figures of this school. To help you remember his name, we can see the word car at the beginning of his name, and we all know that Germans are famous for making good cars. The Iustus Modernus Pandectarum and Canon Law. The Iustus Modernus Pandectarum rejected the views of the commentators. Remember, the commentators were also called the postglossators. They said that canon law takes preference over Roman law, and that Germanic customary law takes preference over both canon law and Roman law. We can see this in the following diagram. This shows the hierarchy according to the Iustus Modernus Pandectarum. Let's now look at Germany in the 19th century. During the early 19th century, a new school developed called the Historical School. The Historical School developed as a reaction against the doctrine of the law of nature. The doctrine of the law of nature saw the law as fixed and unchangeable. The Historical School considered the law to be adaptable and in line with national spirit. They studied Roman law for its scientific interest. They were not interested in its practical application. Savigny was one of the main jurists of this school. He is seen as one of the greatest jurists of all time. Let's now look at the codification of German law. German civil law was codified in the Bürgerliches Gesetzbuch. The reception of Roman law in the Netherlands. Here it is important to look at the different provinces of the Netherlands. To remember the different provinces, we can use the following story. Uncle Gary hates frying omelets on the stove. The U stands for Utrecht. The G stands for Gelderland. The H stands for Holland. The F stands for Friesland. The O stands for the Ommelands. The second O stands for Overijssel. And finally, we have to remember Zeeland. These are the 7 provinces. Holland and Zeeland experienced an extensive reception of Roman law, while Friesland experienced a complete reception. The reception of Roman law in the Netherlands took place in two stages: early reception and reception proper. Let's look at early reception. During this time, French influences were felt in the ancient Netherlands. Let's look at reception proper. During this time, the Netherlands were ruled by the Burgundians. Before we look at this in detail, we should also take note that the reception of Roman law can be divided into two types: practical reception and scientific reception. Practical reception is the reception of the actual rules of Roman law, while scientific reception is the reception of the concepts and principles within a system. Let's now look at early reception in more detail. We have just said that during this period, French influences were felt in the ancient Netherlands. The following factors contributed to the spread of Roman law during this time. Ecclesiastical judges, who were church judges, were trained in Orleans, and they had a firm knowledge of Roman law. Dutch jurists were also trained in Orleans, and they were well skilled in drafting legal documents. The third factor was the church, who governed the province of Friesland. Remember, we said that Friesland had a complete reception of Roman law. Let's now look at reception proper in more detail. We have already learned that during this time the Netherlands were ruled by the Burgundians. The Burgundians followed a policy of centralization. This meant that they removed the variations in the laws. To do this, they followed a process of homologation. This means that customs were confirmed and recorded. This strengthened customary law and entrenched Romanist principles. The reception of Roman law in the Netherlands also occurred due to a number of political, economical, and cultural factors. Let's start with the political factors. Here we will look at legislation, customary law, and the courts. Legislation. Legislation was issued which referred to Roman law. Customary law. Customary law, which had Roman influences, was recorded. This meant that the Roman law which had become part of the customs were now recorded as part of the customary law. Take note that Roman law was seen to be subordinate to customary law. In other words, customary law was more important. Note that customary laws had to be proven in court through the use of witnesses before they could be recorded. The courts. High courts were created, and the jurists on the bench were schooled in Roman law. Let's now look at the economical factors. We will look at the growing economy and the legal advice given by jurists. During this time, trade grew and gave rise to new complicated legal situations. The customary law was not able to cope alone, and so people turned to the influences of Roman law. Legal advice. The rich merchants who were trading received legal advice from the jurists, and these jurists were schooled in Roman law. Let's now look at cultural factors. Here we will focus on the University of Louvain and the Church. The university contributed to the reception of Roman law through its students and professors. The Church played an important role in the establishment of the university, and this meant that students could get a doctorate in both Roman and canon law. Let's now look at the codification of the law of the Netherlands. When Napoleon, the French emperor, conquered the Netherlands, he appointed his brother Louis Bonaparte as the emperor of the Netherlands. Louis then introduced and adapted Napoleon's civil code, and this resulted in the codification of the law of the Netherlands. Let's now look at the reception of Roman law in England. England experienced a limited reception of Roman law. Let's have a look at why. This was mainly because of the development of the English common law. To understand this better, we need to look at the three main contributions to the development of the English common law. Number 1, King William. Number 2, the restricted reception of Roman law. And number 3, the three courts, the King's Court, the Court of Chancery, and the Court of Admiralty. Let's look at King William in more detail. King William was a Norman king who conquered England. He established a feudal system. King William also worked towards creating a uniform national legal system, and this was the beginning of English common law. Let's now look at the second contribution to the development of the English common law. This was the restricted reception of Roman law. So why was the reception of Roman law restricted? Number 1, the English common law was a well-established legal system. Number 2, the king did not want to be subject to the Holy Roman Empire's authority. And number 3, the aristocrats feared that Roman law would give the king absolute power. Let's now look at the third contribution to the development of the English common law, namely the three courts. We will first deal with the King's Court. Take note that the King's Court can further be divided into the Court of Exchequer, the Court of Common Pleas, and the King's Bench. The King's Court. This is called Curia Regis in Latin. This is the oldest court, and it comprises of three courts. Let's look at the first one, the Court of Exchequer. This court heard financial matters. An easy way to remember this is to see the word check in the middle of the court's name. An example of these financial matters would be taxation cases. The second court is the Court of Common Pleas. This court heard the disputes between common citizens, or ordinary citizens. The third court here is the King's Bench. This court heard matters in which the Crown had a direct interest, for example, criminal cases. Remember that these three courts make up the King's Court as a whole. What are the characteristics of the law of the King's Court? Here the law developed on a casuistic basis, in other words, on a case-to-case basis. The law of procedure was very important and played a central part. Civil procedure was based on a writ system. Take note that a writ is a formal written order which is issued by a governmental body in the name of the sovereign power. In most cases, this government body is a court. An example of a writ would be a warrant. The rules of evidence were strictly applied, and the application of common law was unsystematic. Let's now look at the second court, the Court of Chancery. In the word Chancery, we can see the E and the Y highlighted. This gives you a clue that the Court of Chancery deals with equity. Here, the Lord Chancellor decided cases on the basis of equity. The word equity means fair, and thus we can see that another law developed alongside the common law, namely the law of equity. Let's look at the law of equity's rules. Number 1. Equity acts in personam. This means that the law of equity considered each litigant's personal circumstances. Number 2. Equity follows the law. Here, the law that is being referred to is common law. This rule meant that the parties to a dispute could only rely on the law of equity where the common law answer was unfair. Number 3. Equity prevails. This meant that where the law of equity and the common law each gave different solutions to a legal problem, the law of equity would be followed. Let's now look at the third and final court, the Court of Admiralty. The Court of Admiralty dealt with all maritime and commercial cases. The presiding officer was the admiral. This court followed the law merchant. The law merchant was an international commercial law which governed trade. This law was based on Roman law. Take note, over time, traditional common law and equity law merged together to form the English common law as we know it today. Let's now look at the reception of Roman law in Scotland. Scotland experienced a strong reception of Roman law. This was for many reasons. Firstly, they fought many wars with England during the 13th and 14th centuries, and because of this, they had many European allies and were thus influenced by them. Scottish students also attended European universities, where they were trained in Roman law and canon law. When these students returned to Scotland as legal practitioners, they applied the rules and principles of Roman law in cases where Scottish customary law was deficient. In 1707, England and Scotland were unified, and the influences of the Scottish legal system were then felt in England, and vice versa.